And we've got more now on those dueling pardons between the outgoing and incoming administrations. First, newly sworn-in President Trump issued roughly 1,500 pardons on his first day in office and commuted the sentences of 14 of his supporters in connection with the January 6th insurrection. Trump explained that decision while in the Oval Office yesterday.
So this is January 6th. These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
Yes.
Full pardon. We hope they come out tonight, frankly. They're expecting it. Approximately 1,500 people. Six commutations.
Were there any cases you did not commute or pardon people?
We're looking at different things, but the commutations would be the ones that we'll take a look, and maybe it'll stay that way, or it'll go to, full pardon.
Should there be punishment for the people who assaulted law enforcement officers that day?
Well, I will say this. They've been in jail for a long time already. I see murderers in this country get 2 years, 1 year, and maybe no time. So they've already been in jail for a long time. These people have been destroyed. What they've done to these people is outrageous. There's rarely been anything like it in history, in the history of our country. And even people that were aggressive, and in many cases, I believe they happen to be outside agitators, but, what do I know, right?
It all comes after Joe Biden's decision to issue a slew of preemptive pardons in the final hours of his presidency, all of those to protect people that Trump had previously threatened. They included members of Biden's family, Dr. Anthony Fauci, former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Mark Milley, and other members and staff of the House January 6th Select Committee. Let's bring in MSNBC legal correspondent and former litigator Lisa Rubin. Lisa, I'm so glad you're here this morning because there's so many legal ramifications that I want to get to with you. But first, your reaction to the pardon of these January 6th defendants. It was everybody, not just the nonviolent offenders that J.D. Vance and others were trying to use to soften this promise.
And Allie, J.D. Vance wasn't the only person who communicated that. That was a message that we heard from multiple people associated with Trump World and for weeks. What I was shocked by last night, as you just said, is the breadth of it. When Trump said that he was going to pardon roughly 1,500 people, that still left nearly 100 people if you talk about the full totality of people who have been charged with January 6 crimes. At last count, there are 1,583 of them. I thought maybe they have a different understanding of what constitutes a violent offense than I do. And then I looked at the real language of the executive order and was stunned to find while there weren't just 6 commutations, as Trump had said from the Oval, there were 14. It was a full pardon for anyone committed of any January 6th offense. And with respect to anyone who hasn't yet been convicted or tried, there was a directive to the Department of Justice to immediately dismiss those cases and release those people from detention.
And then I wonder if we could keep looking at this through the specific January 6th lens, because you turn then to the outgoing president's pardons and those that he issued to members of the Select Committee, including Liz Cheney and the chairman, Benny Thompson, also staff. But you saw something that links not just the actions that Trump took on his pardons, but the preemptive pardons, and then what Trump has been saying about what the January 6th committee did or actually didn't do, which is destroy the records of their investigation. Can you tie all of this together? Because nothing happens in a vacuum.
Yeah, Trump had a lot of opportunities to talk yesterday, not just in his inaugural address. He obviously talked afterwards in a room off of the Capitol Rotunda. And then in the footage that you're showing right now in the Oval Office, it was sort of this discursive back and forth between signing the papers that his White House Staff Secretary Will Sharp was presenting him with and engaging with members of the press, including our own Peter Alexander. That's when I realized that he was perseverating on something that he had said earlier in the day, that the members of the January 6th committee had destroyed documents. Not only is that demonstrably false, but what Trump is trying to do here is sell a narrative that these people have committed a crime, because it could be a crime to destroy or mutilate or conceal records that are used in a government function. In fact, many January 6th defendants were charged with obstruction of Congress or obstruction of government functions. Given that, what Trump is essentially saying is an acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt. Well, then what does that say about the 1,500 people to whom he gave a full pardon, or to whom he decided yesterday whose cases shouldn't go forward. What's good for the goose, Allie, here is good for the gander. I reject wholesale, by the way, that the members of the January 6th committee and their staffs committed any crime. But if Trump is the one accepting the narrative that to pardon someone means that they have done something criminal, in fact, that was the excuse he gave for why he didn't pardon himself, then he's going to have to accept that narrative with respect to all of the January 6th defendants, too.
Yeah, and in terms of the groundwork that he's trying to lay, I remember when Republicans were able to take back control of the House and they asked the committee to preserve its documents so that they could continue working off of them. So certainly that's pretty easy to disprove. I want to pivot to one other thing that Trump did yesterday among a slew of things that he signed was the changes that he's trying to make to birthright citizenship in this country. That would be basically changing and amending a constitutional amendment through the office of the president. Can you talk about, A, can he do that, and B, the way that he's trying to change this rule?
Well, first of all, the question of can he do that? The answer should be no. And in fact, Trump knows that because he was asked, again, in that same Oval Office signing ceremony, as the press was looking on, somebody must have said something to him, to which he responded, well, that might be right, or you might have a good point. He was essentially acknowledging, yeah, this might not be legal, and yet we're going to go ahead and try it anyway. The argument that he is making is that some of those born in the United States are somehow not subject to the jurisdiction of this country, and that both being born here and being subject to the jurisdiction of the country are necessary predicates to birthright citizenship. I think he's wrong, but there will be a long and lengthy legal battle. The Trump modus operandi seems to be act first, determine the legality later. And that, as you and I both know, friend, is not a sound basis to start a presidency.
And certainly that's already beginning. It's what's sure to be lengthy court battle. I think 2 hours it took for folks to start filing suits about that. And then, of course, Trump himself, on a personal level, is no stranger to legal woes. But are those now all just over? Poof, he's the president again?
Well, Allie, you know that when Jack Smith and his team decided not to go forward with those 2 federal indictments, they dismissed one case with prejudice and without prejudice, and withdrew an appeal without prejudice. Theoretically, that means that at some point those cases could be revived. But of course, the statutes of limitation may not survive until after the expiration of his presidency. And then, of course, he still could pardon himself at the very expiration of his presidency. So whether or not Donald Trump will ever be held accountable for the alleged crimes he committed during his first term and thereafter, that remains to be seen. But you can see an emboldened Trump approaching Trump 2.0, his second presidency, with a feeling that he is immune from criminal prosecution in a broad way. If he didn't have that feeling, I would surmise that he wouldn't have done some of the things that he and his administration did yesterday.
Lisa Rubin, our usual legal tour de force, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.